this does not need introduction, I think, this topic, because it's really at the forefront of what's happening in terms of a lot of the terms that used to be thrown around without much theoretical and practical examples, which is unipolarity, multipolarity, de-dollarization, and so forth. And I don't think that there's a better person to present this topic to us to give us more clarity, which is the question of China's relation with Africa. Last 2 weeks ago, I was giving a talk with the Black Alliance for Peace, and it's very sad to see that so many self-proclaimed Pan-Africanists who view the rise of multipolarity as new authoritarianism and new hegemony and new oppression that's just replacing the United States. And I think that there's much clarity that we need to engage with. At the same time, not too much celebration that this is going to be emancipatory rising pole. Before joining the Global Pan-African Movement, I've learned a lot by just reading about this topic from reading Mwalimu's work. And so I think this is just a great opportunity to have this internal education session from Mwalimu himself to enlighten us with a little bit of history, also theory, and also the implications on the Global Pan-African Movement. So I'm not going to take too much space giving introductions, because I think we all know who Mwalimu is. So the floor is yours. Thank you so much for this.
Thank you so much. Makini, can you give me share screen?
I gave you sharing. You should be able to share.
Okay, good evening, everybody. I am wanting to speak tonight about the conjuncture. And I may take a little time, but I hope you'll bear with me, because we see what is happening between China and Africa as part of the conjunctural crisis of capitalism. What do we mean by conjuncture? What do we mean by conjuncture? We mean by conjuncture the 5 points that we're going to cover is a conjunctural crisis of capitalism, revolution in China and the Bandung movement, the rise of China, from China to the WTO and BRICS, Chinese relations with Africa, and the challenges ahead. Conjuncture refers to a combination of various factors, circumstances that come together to shape a particular situation. It involves examining the interplay between different elements and their potential to each other. The last major conjuncture that we saw in capital, the major international conjuncture, was the Depression and World War II. Since that time, we've been through others, such as the financial crisis, COVID, and the war in Ukraine. So we now are at a new conjuncture in global politics. And the elements of this conjuncture always involves global economic shifts. So changes in geopolitics and geoeconomy. For us in the Global Pan-African Movement, we also see in the conjuncture new social movements. For example, one of the most important social movements at the last major conjuncture was the Pan-Africanists who started the brigades about Ethiopia. And those same people who organized around the Italian invasion of Abyssinia in 1935 were the same people who organized after World War II for the independence of Africa. So the Pan-Africanists, radical Pan-Africanists, social justice, women's rights, reparations, white supremacists, anti-imperialists, these are all the social forces that are involved in this present conjuncture. So what we are seeing in this present conjuncture is the importance of China in the international system and the rise of China. China was up until 1800 the most important economy in the world. And the Chinese had a revolution in 1949. The revolution started in 1911 and it went through civil war. But the People's Republic of China is a multinational, multi-ethnic state. I want to stress that because when people speak about China, they forget that China is comprised of many nationalities and ethnic groups. There are 4 municipalities: Beijing, Tianjin, Shanghai, and Chongqing. For example, Chongqing as a city has over 30 million persons. So having socialist organization to run a city like Chongqing is no mean achievement. There are 5 autonomous regions in China: Xinjiang, Tibet, Mongolia, Xinjiang, and Guangxi. Now, you will have heard a lot of them on the news of the Xinjiang problems, especially with the Uyghurs. So these are outstanding problems of integrating different ethnic groups in China. There are 2 administrative regions, Hong Kong and Macau, and there are the outstanding questions of how to integrate China or Taiwan into China. I want to stress, because I never grasped this until I was in China, is the fact that China is a multi-ethnic society. And the question of integrating the Chinese society in different language is something that has been very important for the Chinese Revolution. I should add that there is a challenge in China of great Han chauvinism against other minority ethnic groups in China. But this is something that the Communist Party is struggling with in China and in Chinese society. So the Chinese have been able to manage their ethnic problems because they have embarked on what they call Chinese revolution and socialist transformation. The Chinese workers for 800 years and the peasants were very, very exploited. And the Chinese Communist Party that was started in 1921 organized a communist party to fight for the freedom of the workers and peasants. So the party that is in power in China, in public position, is a party of the workers and peasants of China. In the 1930s, they fought a civil war against the nationalist forces and imperialist forces led by Chiang Kai-shek. And the Chinese Communist Party was molded through guerrilla warfare and peasant organization. Now, this is very important in terms of those who study the transition to new societies, because according to the Marxist theory, revolution was to come into being through the workers and working class. Mao Zedong and the Chinese Communist Party said that the vanguard of their revolution was the Chinese peasantry, and they won in 1949. And this was a great victory because it expanded the socialist camp in China. And if you go to Tiananmen Square, which was the headquarters of the Chinese Republic, you'll see this poster of Mao Zedong, who became the leader of China. But China went through many twists and turns. I want to stress this, that it went through many twists and turns. First twist and turn was the 1949 to 1959, consolidating the power of the peasantry with land reform. That means that the landowners were expropriated and the land was vested in the state. The second was the Great Leap Forward, where they attempted to build industrialization from the grassroots up. The third major upheaval in China was the Cultural Revolution in the 1960s. This was a revolution that was inside of the Communist Party to root out what they call counter-revolutionaries. And many of the current leaders in China were people whose parents and family were purged in the Cultural Revolution. Mao Zedong, the first leader of China, and Zhou Enlai, passed into the other world in 1976. And after Mao Zedong died, there's someone called Deng Xiaoping who took over. When Deng Xiaoping took over, the Chinese talked about the reform and the reform strategy in China. But before they went to the reform strategy, I want to stress what is important about China. The first and most important thing that is important about China for Africa is the agrarian question. That is, China embarked on a project which it still is not completely succeeded on in how to feed itself. And the priority in the society was agriculture, and that it must be able to feed the people. And at the beginning, they depended on artisanal production. And the difference between the Chinese Revolution and the Russian Revolution is in the Russian Revolution, there was forced collectivization. And forced collectivization in Russia and the excesses of Stalin led to counter-revolution in the rural areas. So the Russian Revolution was always at war with the Russian peasantry. The difference in China is that the Chinese peasants are very clear that they own the country, the land belongs to the people, and political power should be in the hands of the representatives of the peasantry. And we're going to have to come back to that because the Communist Party in China has changed quite a bit. So the objective of the Communist Party of China after 1949 was to construct an integrated and sovereign modern industrial system, manage the relation of this system with rural pet production. In other words, there was supposed to be a management of the system between the rural areas and urban areas, and to, at the same time, to integrate China into the world economy. And China succeeded in building an integrated, modern, productive system. So China, when it came in 1949, the Chinese Revolution, China joined what was called the Bandung Project. The Bandung Project came out of those who were fighting against colonialism. And the Bandung Conference was held in 1955 in Indonesia. It was an inaugural moment in the formation of a third world, not as a place on the map, but as a project. Political imaginary linked the darker nation of the world in the common struggle for freedom. So China placed itself in Bandung, in the Bandung Project, and China was at the forefront of what is called Afro-Asian solidarity. And in this picture, you can see there were people like Nasser, Sukarno, Tito, the Nehru, and who's not in this picture was Zhou Enlai, who was a prime minister of China. So the spirit of Bandung organized around Afro-Asian solidarity, around the decolonization, and it was to blunt the anti-communist offensive which had been mobilized by the United States in the Cold War. The Bandung Project supported the independence of countries like Algeria. They called for a new international economic order, absolute right of states to control extraction of resources, establishment and recognition of state-managed resource cartels to stabilize commodity prices, the regulation of transnational corporations, no strings attached technology transfers from north to south, the granting of preferential non-reciprocal trade preferences to countries in the south, forgiveness of certain debts the states in the south owe to the north. Together, all these proposals amounted to an assertion of the economic sovereignty of the post-colonial south. Now, this is very important to guide the foreign policy of China in the period of Bandung. And in the process of supporting African liberation, China was on the side of those who were fighting against colonialism in Africa, in the Caribbean, in South America, and in Asia. And one of the most important projects that China embarked on, and I think Comrade Walter Bogoya, I invited him because at the end I wanted to say something about the relations between Tanzania and China in the 1960s. When this agreement was signed to build the Tazara Railroad, it was a symbol of Chinese support for liberation in Africa because the Southern African countries were very dependent on the transportation links through South Africa. So they wanted to create transportation links out of to bring Zambian copper out of Zambia so that it wouldn't go through either Portuguese-controlled Mozambique or apartheid South Africa. And so the agreement was made between Mao and Nyerere. And one of the comrades of Pan-Africanists who worked very hard on this was Abdul Rahman Babu. And this is a picture between Nyerere and Mao. You have your difficulties and we have ours, but they are not the same. We will help you build this railway, even if it's for sake building our own. So this is our railroad. It was called Freedom Railroad, was 1,860 kilometers. The Chinese dispatched 50,000 engineers and technicians. If you drove through Tanzania in that time, you would see the Tanzanian workers working very closely side by side with the Chinese workers. Oh, this is a very big difference between Chinese workers in Africa today and African workers. At that time, the Chinese Communist Party was committed to relationship with African workers. Now, the important point about this is that China was giving solidarity at a time when the World Bank and the IMF and the United States says that this railroad could not be built. It said the railroad was going through terrain that was too mountainous to build a railroad through. And so the Chinese showed by building this railroad that they could do what was considered a miracle. It is part of the transformation that was going on in China at that time, which has to do with the confidence of the Chinese people. Because in the 18th century, China was the largest economy in the world, accounting for 25% of the world output. By the first half of the 20th century, China was known as the poor man in Asia, and the China was attacked by European colonialists in in the 18th century, especially some of you remember the Opium War, when the Western countries started a war to attack China. Its economy only produced 5% of global output in 1949. So we can see in 70 years, the transition in China. In 1949, 89% of Chinese population lived in the countryside, with agriculture accounting for 60% of the total output. Although the Chinese economy backbone is agriculture, agriculture and industry now accounts for 60% of the GDP in the country. So the Chinese economy has doubled in size every 8 years. And I want to stress that this was under the leadership of the Communist Party and what is called a command economy. That's an economy that was based on state organization and private capital. So China has been able to invest in transforming its economy from a poor, backward country. So 38% of the Chinese huge economic stimulus package that they did to revive the economy after the 2008 financial crisis went into railway, irrigation, airport construction. I want to stress this point because we're going to come back to this in relationship to Africa, that infrastructure is very fundamental to transforming your economy. Now, this is a point that everybody agrees on. Between 1981 and 2005, 600 million Chinese were brought out of poverty. Now, everybody agrees with this, that this is the most phenomenal transformation that has taken place anywhere in the world, uplifting the standard of living of 600 million people. And in the past 5 years, the Chinese economy has overtaken the US economy. That's according to the parity. The Chinese economy is projected in 5 years to be 40% larger than the US economy. According to the purchasing power parity, it applies a common set of prices to all items. China is producing much more as a manufacturing country than the United States of America. China produced 1 billion metric tons of steel in 2021. The United States produced 90 million. China generated 8.5 million gigawatts of hours of electricity. China has 307,000 megawatts of installed solar capacity. Now, this chart shows the China overtaking the United States, and this is sourced from the International Monetary Fund. Now, there's a book that has been written by Martin Jacks called When China Rules the World, that the Western financial crisis in important measure as an expression of the new global era and therefore a portent of what is to come. I don't agree with Martin Jack that China will rule the world, but his book is about 600 pages of how the Chinese economy has changed. Let me now move on to the question of how the West interacted with Africa and interacted with people in Asia because of China. Because of the Chinese Revolution and when the United States was fighting a war in Vietnam, the United States and the World Bank invested heavily in Hong Kong, Taiwan, South Korea, and Japan. And they invested heavily in what was then a great ideological struggle. And this was based on what they call the success of the Asian tigers. Now, if you study Africa and people talk about the difference between Africa and China, they will always say that, I'm saying Singapore or Korea or Malaysia, they will say Malaysia was at the same level as Ghana in 1957, and Ghana is so far ahead. Or the Congo was at the same level of South Korea. And they use these comparisons to say Africa is backward. But the difference was that in Africa, the United States and the West destroyed African economies. They overthrew Kwame Nkrumah, they killed Patrice Lumumba, they destabilized the Congo. What did they do in Asia? They supported land reform. They allowed Asian capitalists to copy patents. They supported local industries to build up. They opened their markets to imports to help indigenous capitalists. So when people tell you that the difference between the Africa and Asia was because Africans were lazy, one has to bear in mind these differences. So China is now in a position where it is now in a position to trade, and it is now the major trading partner of most countries in the world. Chinese trade with Africa has moved from 12 million in 1950, 70 years ago, to 10 billion in 2000, to in 2021, $243 billion. That China is the biggest investor in Africa. And Chinese provide loans to Africa for infrastructure. And the loans to Africa between 2000 and 2020 is over $160 billion. The top 10 government recipients of Chinese loans were Angola, Ethiopia, Zambia, Kenya, Egypt, Nigeria, Cameroon, and South Africa. Now, you would have heard something about the Chinese debt trap in Africa. And there's been a lot of propaganda against China, how China has taken over Ugandan airport because Uganda owes so much money. The figures about Chinese relationship with Africa in relationship to loans does not support that propaganda. And in fact, the information about China taking over infrastructure in Zambia or in Uganda was not true. What we should compare is that the Chinese loans to Africa does not compare to the IMF loans to Africa. The IMF, the World Bank, and the Western countries, Africa is more indebted to the IMF, the World Bank, and European countries such as Britain, France, and the United States, Germany, and Belgium, than it is to China. But that is not usually discussed. I want to now turn to the question of African minerals, because I gave you figures about Chinese industry. And Chinese industry could not develop without African minerals and without minerals from Asia. So China is very active on the global stage seeking minerals. And now, one of the things we should note about mining in Africa is that mining in Africa has always been to the detriment of the African workers since colonialism. And Sam Merriman speaks about Africa of the mineral reserves and the labor reserves. But if you know anything about South Africa, you would know that from 1913 to 1967, African mine workers did not get a wage increase. And it is only since apartheid that the African mine workers, their situation has changed. The mining conditions of African workers have been established because of the apartheid conditions in Africa. And what China has done since 2000 is to join with Western countries in exploiting African workers in the same measure as Western countries exploit African workers. What I presented here is the value chain for gold. Now, I'm focusing on gold because gold was the mineral that was the mainstay of the Western economy up until 1971 when the US dollar was backed by gold. And there are two sources of gold, mining or the recycling gold. It's a smelt and refined gold. Now, what you have in Africa is that Africa does not have a Pan-African gold council that can regulate the production, the marketing, and selling of gold. According to the Western press, the annual gold output in tons, China is the #1 gold producer in the world in 2019. And you'll see from this chart from the World Gold Council that China is the #1 gold producer, Russia is the second gold producer, Australia the third, fourth is the United States, fifth. And then Ghana and South Africa is way down the list. What you will notice is if you take all of Africa gold production together, the African gold production would be much further than that of China or the United States. If you add Ghana, South Africa, Sudan, Mali, the Republic of the Congo, Tanzania, Burkina Faso, I've read in the newspaper where they found so much gold in Karamojong in Uganda. There's gold in Ethiopia. There's gold production in Guinea. The point I'm trying to make is that gold production exists all over Africa, but it does not accrue to the African workers and poor peasants because of the lack of organization of Africans in the area of gold. So the mineral producing countries in Africa, South Africa, Nigeria, Algeria, Angola, Libya, Egypt, Ghana, DRC, Gabon, Zimbabwe, all of these, you can measure the stability of the country. You can measure the ability of the country to reproduce itself based on the condition of the workers in the mining sector. The point is that in Africa, you have over 9 million what you call artisanal mine workers. Artisanal mine workers are workers who work in mines like gold mines in Ghana. They call them galamsey. The Chinese capitalists would come into Ghana. So you have two kinds of gold mining in Ghana. Galamsey gold mining, that's artisanal gold mining, and state control or international capital control gold mining, such as Anglo Gold, Ashanti. but the Chinese capitalists would interact with the local galamsey who is controlled by some local chief. So the point I'm trying to make here is that Chinese individual capitalists who come into Africa come in collaboration with African ruling class to exploit African workers. I want to make that point very strongly. There are three different Chinese entities that interacts with Africa. There's first the Chinese state. Secondly, there's Chinese state institutions and state organizations. And then there's Chinese capitalists. So a Chinese capitalist who is a very small person in China with $1 million would go into Africa, into Uganda or Ghana or the DRC, and enter into agreement with local politicians to be able to exploit the people in that. The other point I want to make is that the people who control the minerals exchange in the world are the Western capitalists and not the Chinese. The number one exchange in the world for metals is the London Metal Exchange. And the British and the Americans and the Canadians and the French dominate the exploitation of minerals in Africa. You may not know this based on the propaganda that's coming out, but the London Metal Exchange, Chicago Mercantile Exchange, New York Mercantile Exchange, those three are the top mineral exchanges in the world. Then there's a Shanghai Exchange, which is now becoming very important because China is involved in buying minerals from all parts of the world. There was a multi-commodity exchange in India, the Hong Kong Exchange, Tokyo Exchange, Moscow Exchange, the Boursa Istanbul, and the one that we should pay close attention to, and I believe those of you who work in university and have students should pay close attention to the Dubai Gold and Commodities Exchange. The Dubai Gold and Commodities Exchange is the number one exchange for flying illicit minerals out of Africa. If you see in Rwanda or in Uganda, a plane from the Emirates flying into Uganda every Tuesday, they're picking up gold that is coming out of the Congo. So the fact is, although the West speaks about China as the exploiter of African minerals, Britain and the London Stock Exchange control over 1 trillion worth of African resources in 5 commodities: oil, gold, diamonds, coal, and platinum. So what the Chinese have done in order to enter into competition with Britain and the United States is to do what they call resource for infrastructure contract. The resource for infrastructure contract means that the Chinese would sign an agreement, let's say, with the Congolese government to build railroads, and then they would agree that they would ship so much cobalt out of the Congo. Now, the World Bank and the IMF is completely opposed to the resource for infrastructure contract, but the reconstruction of Angola has come about through the resource for infrastructure contract. So these are the contracts up until 2010 when I was following it. Congo-Brazzaville was an infrastructure contract to build a dam. Sudan, build a power plant. Angola, repair the infrastructure. This is the one that I'm more familiar with. The Zimbabwe, Chromium, and the DRC. Now, this infrastructure contracts has changed the face of Africa. You now have major highways across Africa that were not there before. The highways that are still being built. And for me, the Chinese have been very involved in roads, railroads, power plants, and ports in Africa. The big limitation of Africa is Africans do not have the infrastructure to trade with each other. Africa accounted for 2.8% of world trade. And if Africa is to transform itself, it must develop agriculture. My pet project that I am pushing very hard in terms of infrastructure is for the building of a canal from the Congo to Lake Chad, building a canal from the eastern bank of the Congo all the way through Central African Republic, through Chad and Cameroon up to Chad. And this is to replenish the Lake Chad that has lost 90% of its water. Let me say this, that this infrastructure project, France and the West oppose this project. The war in Libya to destroy Libya was directly related to this project because the war in Libya stemmed from France was opposing to the man-made river that was being developed by the Libyans to link up with this Transaqua project. The country that's been pushing this is Italy, and in 2017, the Italians joined up with the Chinese for this project. The West is completely opposed because this would be a project which would unite Africa. As you can see, the into which country can negotiate with the Chinese is dependent on whether the country has a government that stands on its own. I will use the example of Tanzania and the Standard Gauge Railroad. The Chinese and the Tanzanians signed an agreement for the for the building this railroad. And the president of Tanzania did not like the terms of the agreement. And he rejected the terms and went to the Turkish. And as a result, the Chinese have come back to them. And I think Walter will say something more about the building of the Standard Gauge Railroad. So I mention this because of the propaganda against China, against modern-day slavery in the Congo. I am making the point that the mining conditions of workers all over Africa need change because we have to fight for the rights of workers. There are books coming out every week about how the Congo powers our lives. That is about the role of the Congo in producing coltan and cobalt. The United States, in its Mineral Security Partnership that was signed last year at the African Leaders Summit, is precisely because they believe that China controls the market for lithium and cobalt, and they must get these minerals from Zambia and the DRC. Now, the Chinese are caught in a liquidity trap. Liquidity trap is that China has become an industrial power. As an industrial power, China earns foreign exchange, and it has massive reserves of over $3 trillion. But in the United States of America, in the Federal Reserve, the Chinese have what they call $1.2 trillion. The Chinese had believed in Wall Street and with putting their money in Wall Street. But since 2008 and the financial crisis, the Chinese have been trying to get their excess liquidity out of Wall Street. And so they're investing it in the third world. And so the Chinese realize that what we have is fiat dollars. I think it's important to spend a minute here. Fiat money is money derives its value from government regulation or law. In other words, the US dollar gets its value from the military management of the international system. And I stress gold in Africa because everybody is trying to grab gold in Africa because of what is going on now in terms of de-dollarization. The United States opposed the reform of the IMF. And one of the things that we have from the third world, from the Bridgetown Initiative, is to call for the reform of the IMF. And so the IMF could spend more money in third countries. So BRICS is now a challenge to the IMF. BRICS is anchored by China and Russia. It comprises of Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa. The BRICS created what they call the BRICS Development Bank. And so what we now have, we're in the midst of a war. I want to stress this. We're in the conjuncture of a war. The war is because of the United States military management of the international system. And that war is to break up BRICS. And that war is to ensure that there is no alternative currency that will challenge the US dollar. So we have come out of the COVID as one part of this war, where we had vaccine apartheid. And then we now are into another part of this war. So this war involves the weaponization of everything. We saw how the pandemic was weaponized. We saw how trade was weaponized. We saw how supply chains were weaponized. We saw how information is weaponized. We saw how all aspects of life are weaponized. So in this war, we now have new international formations, such as BRICS, the Association of Southeast Asian Nations, the Union of South American States and Caribbean and Latin American countries, North American Free Trade Area, the Gulf Cooperation Council, African Union. But to all these formations, central to all these formations is Global Africa. Because Global Africa and the African peoples are to be found in South America, in CELAC, we have over 150 million Africans. In North America, in NAFTA, we have over 50 million Africans. In the African Union, we have 1.4 million Africans. So global Africans are very important to these global formations. And the United States, you followed last week where the United States has reached a point where it cannot continue to on the path that it is. The United States debt is now 119% of the GDP. Each person in the United States owes $94,000. And last week, they signed a debt ceiling deal so the United States can continue to print money. In printing money, the United States is now using its military against all countries of the world. And this is called sanctions. Through its sanctions, it took the money from Libya, billions of dollars. Through its sanctions, it took money from Iran. Through its sanctions, it took money from Venezuela. Through its sanctions, it took money from Russia. So everybody in the world is trying to get out of the United States dollar, which is now the main international currency. An international currency is one that is used in its own country for transactions. Everybody wants to get out of the United States dollar. So BRICS created the BRICS Development Bank, which is the bank which is to compete with the IMF and the World Bank. The challenge with the BRICS Bank, however, is that its contingency reserve arrangement is very similar to the IMF. And its exchange alliance is competing with the derivatives market. So those of us who are involved in the debate about BRICS are calling on the South African government, the South African comrades, that they should be in the debate about the BRICS Bank, so the BRICS Bank does not have the same things as the IMF. I'm saying the word I should use is the same conditionalities in giving loan. BRICS comprise 40% of the world population, 25% of the GDP, and there are many states applying to join BRICS: Indonesia, Turkey, Egypt, Iran, Nigeria, Syria, Algeria, Argentina, Afghanistan, and Saudi Arabia. In other words, most states in the world see BRICS as an alternative to the G7, and especially countries of the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership in Asia. Let me move to the conclusion. The situation is that the RMB cannot be internationalized. The RMB, the Chinese currency, cannot be internationalized because China is a capitalist state run by a capitalist state in a socialist organized society. As Sam Ehrman said, The fact the Chinese project is not capitalist does not mean that it is not socialist, only that it makes possible to advance on the long road to socialism. Nevertheless, it's also still threatened with a drift that moves it off that road and ends up with a return, pure and simple, to capitalism. In other words, let me translate this. The Chinese capitalists are in a struggle against the Chinese workers. And the Chinese capitalists who interface with global Africa are the ones who are exploiting the Chinese workers and peasants. So the Chinese, our task is to develop links with Chinese workers, farmers, students, intellectuals, and progressive Chinese. We're now in the next financial crisis. We've seen it with the fall of these banks this year. We've seen the financial bubbles, and we've seen that the situation has changed. I have argued that if Africa is united, that by 2035, the #1 economy in the world would be Africa because of African resources. In 2023, the #1 economy in the world is the United States. Second is China, which this is according to Center for Economic Bureau for Research. Now, the other figures I showed you said that China has overtaken the United States in 2023. So the US, Japan, China, Germany, India, UK, France, Italy, Canada, and Brazil. You will see that by 2035, a country like the United Kingdom will not be on the chart. So even if 10 African countries come together, on this chart, 2023, Nigeria is already 17 or 18 on the world chart. So the point I'm making is that Africa needs to take steps towards controlling resources and to learn from countries like Indonesia. Indonesia has put a ban on export of unprocessed minerals. I've spoken to Brother Walter Bogoya to say, why is Tanzania African countries exporting unprocessed ore? Indonesia stopped exports of raw ore such as nickel and bauxite. The European Union has taken Indonesia to court. Indonesia say, you can take us to court to thy kingdom come, but we are not going to allow this thing. So what we want to see is how Africa can move on a new path. Today, all over Eastern United States, we have a situation of pollution. Now, Chinese growth has led to big problems of pollution in China. That's because Chinese capitalists have no care for the Chinese working class. We are looking towards a multipolar world that will fight pollution, that will be undergirded by the global South. If you look at this map up at the top, the first map you see here was one where United States was dominant, was a unipolar world. If you look at the world of the future and the multipolar world, the center of the world is Africa. That is literally and economically. But we can only become the center of the world through progressive Pan-African organizing that builds the power of the working peoples all across Africa. The Ukraine war is bringing a new situation in the world. China is leading the struggle to bring peace in Ukraine, and the 12-point peace plan that the China is very clever. Because if you notice the 12-point peace plan, the first point of the Chinese peace plan is to say they disagree with Russia for invading Ukraine. The Chinese peace plan has been put on the table, but the United States do not want to have peace. What the United States has been pushing is what they call the Thucydides trap, that the United States is destined for war. They use the analogy of the Sparta attacking Athens, and there's a big industry in the United States about war with China. Where will Africa stand in this war in China? There's a general in the United States who gave an actual date. I've spoken about trade war, financial war, cyber warfare. Now we talk about actual kinetic warfare. Where will Africa stand in this war? The position I think global Pan-African movement should take is Africa should be independent and Africa should defend the interests of Africa and oppose all imperialist projects, so that African position on this war is Africa is against war and it's against white supremacy, which is the driving force for this war with China. The African Leaders Summit, which was held last year, is the one which is mobilizing Africans to fight on the United States against China. I want to end by quoting Deng Xiaoping on Chinese imperialism. And Deng Xiaoping said, if one day China should change her color and turn into a superpower, if she should play the tyrant in the world and everywhere subject others to bullying, aggression, and exploitation, the people of the world should identify her as social imperialism, expose it, oppose it, and work together with the Chinese people to overthrow it. I'm saying that in the war that is coming, the African workers should work with Chinese workers if Chinese capitalists continue on the path. We should be fighting with the Chinese, so just as though the Chinese got reparations. And they said to France, before you can invest in China, you must return all the stolen artifacts. And I think Kaylee is on this call and she might want to learn from this. What we have is that China is very dependent on Africans in the United Nations. And we should be calling for the abolition of the IMF and the World Bank. And the Pan-African intellectual leadership is what is needed in this conjuncture. If in the World War II, we had 15 years where most of Africa was independent, what will happen 15 years after this war in Iraq? We see that there's room for African and China cooperation. Demilitarization of the planet, working to reverse global warming, establishing global standards for working people, working to support anti-racism, strengthening the Permanent Forum, working to deal with global health pandemics, banning chemical and biological weapons. I know I took more time than I planned, but that is why my position on the global Pan-African movement and what its position should be on African relations with China.
Thank you. I learned so much, but I also noticed that Brother Walter needs to leave in roughly 15 minutes. But we have on the agenda a commentary potentially, and then afterwards we can have question and answer, just to take advantage of the opportunity that Walter is with us. So Walter, the floor is yours, and then we'll transition to questions, comments, and concerns.
Well, thank you very much, but thank you so much indeed. And I can't thank Brother Horace for this extraordinary presentation. It's extraordinary, so much so that I identify very much with everything he says. One thing I just would like to state here is that I think for Africa, the question is, who is our enemy? Who is our adversary? And who are our friends? I think without sorting this question out for ourselves, Africa will continue to suffer from both sides. During the struggle for liberation, the liberation movements in Angola, in Mozambique, the leaders were always asking this question: who is the enemy? And then there's another question: as how do we treat those who are our adversaries and those who are our friends? Again, I think that Africa has to decide vis-a-vis China. Is China our friend or is China our adversary? And I think just going through what Malim Horace has explained, at this particular conjuncture, I would like to say China is our friend, it's Africa's friend. And this is not, by the way, a new development, because China has been consistently a friend of Africa during the whole African liberation struggle. All the weapons were given freely, all the training, and a lot more that is not quantifiable, or diplomatic and so on. The construction of Tazara, by the way, was from money which had already been earmarked for a railway project in China, and it was taken from that and brought to build the railway, which at the time the imperialist countries dubbed the bamboo railway. And from there on, you have seen what Chinese have done in Africa through this construction of communication all over. Africa is connected to a great deal thanks to the Chinese. And these Chinese have not done it simply by being given the projects, but they have competed internationally on many of these tenders, and they have been able to win because they work in a different way. They calculate costs in a different way because the infrastructure, the overheads that they spend are very little compared to Western contracting companies, where, for instance, the managers stay in big hotels, and while the Chinese management and workers usually would stay in the same place and save a great deal on the overheads. But by also doing the work absolutely on time and saving money because of the hard work the Chinese were doing. So, but I think the one problem that we have to also keep in mind is, how do African states receive the assistance of the Chinese and receive the loans of the Chinese? The Chinese, and maybe some criticism might be leveled there, they say, look, if this is what the state wants, if these African leaders want, we will give you that, because we are not here to decide for you how to govern your country. Now, if the African countries are characterized by corrupt leadership, the kind of deals they are going to go in with the capitalist Chinese, or even some of the parastatal organizations of the Chinese, the state-related organizations, will have all the elements that basically do not take the interests of the people in mind. That there'll be deals which are yes, the projects may be viable, but they'll be more costly than they should have been had the contracts been straightforward contracts without this rent-seeking and corruption. In other words, therefore, what the African states themselves, the African people do, unless it is organized, unless there is unity of African people, we cannot play the role that we should play. There is also an even terrible situation. Let me take the example of the Tazara Railway. The Tazara Railway, when it was finished, was an extraordinary piece of equipment. In fact, I traveled on it on the trial run. It was extraordinary. But over time, it was literally run to the ground by, among other reasons, because the agreement said that the general management of the Tazara, the head would be Zambian, and the deputy would be Tanzanian, that transactions would be in foreign currency, although in the two countries. So the Zambians want payment in dollars. But not only that, the businesses in Tanzania, the haulers, the truckers, made sure that this railway was not going to take any cargo. So they ran the Tazara Railway in the ground so much so that at the end, Tanzania and Zambia go back to the Chinese and say, can you help us resurrect the Tazara? And of course, that the Chinese are not very happy. They are, and because again, they're being asked to literally almost rebuild the railway at their expense as a kind of another aid. And you ask yourself, what in the world is this going on? And this can be seen not only in that, but in some other projects, including the rice project in Mbarali in southern Tanzania, where again, there was a very successful rice farm. But as soon as there was interference, and the Chinese eventually left, and the project went to the ground. So there's urgency of African states themselves is seriously questioned. And this puts in the final analysis, give the propaganda to the West that projects by the Chinese don't work, or that the contracts are not transparent, as if their own projects and deals were transparent. Now, there is also a problem, and I think this is interesting, that sometimes there's competition among the Chinese enterprises in these countries, because they're all trying to impress the state in China that they are efficient and they're making money. So that you find some of the bad practices of these companies are not supported by the Chinese state, but they are among competitions among the Chinese themselves, and they're having to cut corners and go into deals that jeopardize finally the relationship between the Chinese state and the country where they are, Tanzania, an African country. This is something that has been observed in Tanzania and I'm sure in other countries, because the Chinese capitalists are fairly ruthless as well. I mean, this is the nature of the capitalists. But I think the point that I would like to make is that unless we can take the Chinese and deal with them as being on the same side, and then be able to have a proper dialogue, unless there is some kind of commitment, because it seems to me all the time that we are not dealing with them as, for instance, traditionally we dealt with the West, where we more or less gave everything away. We like to think of well, it looked like we were not taking our enemies seriously, and we were not taking our friends seriously either. The Chinese, in the end, they don't know, what do we do with, how do we relate with these friends who haven't really, how can I say, who are still very much working in the mind, in the Western mind and Western ideology, Western thinking, and more or less take the Chinese as, well, you know, it's the lesser of the two evils, so to speak. I think this is completely wrong, and I think that the sooner we're able to get out of this, the better. I couldn't agree more with Brother Horace that, well, I think the 1949 revolution in China opened up a new approach also, a new economics, a new socialism, even to say, from the European socialism to a Chinese or Asian socialism, what now the Chinese are calling socialism with the Chinese characteristics. And we cannot refute that, we cannot ignore that. But and it seems to me now is another conjuncture. This war in Ukraine has created an entirely new situation, a situation which opens up a new world, in a new world where realignments have to take place, and seems to me the kind of alignments we take now and how seriously we take those alignments will decide whether we go into the new world with confidence, with unity in particular. If we don't have unity, we will still be marginalized, whether in the new trajectory. I think it is very important for the global Pan-African movement to expose this to do a lot more work, and I think this lecture by Brother Horace should be publicized greatly, so that a lot more knowledge is gained instead of the superficial, basically propaganda, fighting against the propaganda of the Western countries, and where it seems to me certain opportunities are coming up and calling China an imperialist country, which cannot possible. China cannot be an imperialist country, even if tried to be. Cannot be, not this time, and not with the history that it has, and not with the leadership of China that has. But if Africa is continue to be disunited, if Africa has destroyed the trade unions, the labor movements, who is going to be dealing with these other capitalist miners, who are going to make a deal with artisanal miners? If the artisanal miners are not organized, are helped to be independent, to have a stake, to have a voice, how are they going to defend themselves? So this is also the agents of the state, and the characters of the state in Africa is such that we are unable to take advantages of this new trajectory and still have some lingering idea that we could improve the West, the imperialists, we could improve that, which is really how they would, in their own mind, would like to do. So I want to thank you again. I said, excuse me very much. I have an engagement that I'm already half an hour late for, but thank you very much. And I look forward to continue to exchange ideas. Thank you. Santi.
Thank you, Walter, for your comments. You've added, I think, more to the question and answer list that I already have, but anything you would like to respond to quickly, Mwalim, while we have Walter here, or Walter, do you have to excuse yourself?
No, I think I'll have a discussion with Mwalim after.
Okay, then that's good.
Okay.
But thank you so much, Walter.
All right, thank you.
And we will publish this online. It will be on the education website. So yes,
thank you.
Thank you. Okay, so would you like to maybe potentially reply to some of his comments, and then we can go to question and answer?
I think his comments, I would not have any problem with his comments. I would say, based on our internal education, I would want the brothers and sisters in the global Pan-African movement to raise the points that they think, because we're trying to put out what our positions should be in terms of this conjuncture. So I would want to, and we can have questions of clarification and questions just for people to hear their views about this China relationship with Africa.
So then I suggest that we open it for questions and questions from the people who are present. So if you have questions, please share them. Angela, you're unmuted, and Mahi as well. So, yes.
I want to ask, you said that there's the capitalist Chinese and there's the people, the people's movement. Do the people in China understand the difference between these two? The people's movement and the capitalist Chinese? Do they understand this movement?
Yes. In fact, China is a country with more rebellions going on than any other country in the world. And when I was working in China, there is a whole province, part of the province, that was taken over by the peasants because the landlords have taken the land from the peasantry with real estate projections and so forth. And so the problems of the Chinese workers fighting against the capitalists is very profound, rebellions everywhere. Let me give you the biggest problem in China. There are 300 million Chinese without hukou. What is hukou? Hukou is the right of the Chinese to move from one province to the next. So if you're moving from, say, Philadelphia to Georgia, you have to get a permission from the government for you to move into that area. And that permission means that you can get housing, your children can go to school, and you can get work. Now, there are 300 million Chinese who do not have this hukou. Now, they live in a camp, and they live in camps. And the government, just as how they say people are illegally migrating in the United States of America, the government have pitched battles with them. And I went into their camp. And these are the Chinese who proclaim Mao Zedong and Chinese socialism. So yes, the class struggle in China is very intense, but you don't hear about it outside of China.
So in that case, we in the Caribbean, our leaders seem to be related to the capitalists, the Chinese capitalists. So, and therefore, how can we, and our people, we do not understand what you are talking about, what you have just said, which you have just educated us on. So therefore, even I'm talking about our governments, do not, I am going to say that I think that they do not understand what you are speaking about. So therefore, they are cooperating, or they're asking the capitalist Chinese to be of help to our countries. And we've seen some of the things that they're doing in terms of how many workers have to work here, this thing and that. So what needs to happen in this Caribbean region in terms of the Chinese?
Well,
if we are all global Africa, and if we don't understand, how are we going to organize?
Let me say, one of the difference between the Caribbean and Africa, why the Caribbean does not have so many military coups, is that the Caribbean workers are still organized. The Barbadian working class still organized. The Trinidad workers, the oil field workers trade union in Trinidad, OWTU, and Sister Zofia is here, who's worked on this question. I can tell you that when Chinese workers went to Trinidad and saw the autonomy of the Trinidad workers, they were very amazed, and they wanted to learn from the Caribbean workers how could they be organized independent of the state. So I would suggest that if we put our energy and efforts to strengthening working class, small farmers organization, it would be one way of solidarity. And when we meet Chinese intellectuals, academics, or people from the middle strata who are wavering, we introduce them to why it's necessary that they must support struggles for environmental justice in Africa, struggles for reparative justice in Africa, struggles against racial discrimination. Because many Chinese, especially those from the middle class who study in Germany, France, Australia, or other parts of the world, internalize white racism. So the white racism has been growing in China because of the exposure of Chinese capitalists. And we have millions of them in the past 10 years studying overseas and internalizing white racism.
Thank you.
Hi, Chair, can I ask a question?
Yes, please. Yes, please.
Right,
Zofia.
Thank you. I saw the very interesting projections about Africa's place in the world, according to the chart that he gave. But one of he kept raising as a necessary factor, a necessary ingredient for that to happen, the question of African countries coming together, or at least some semblance of, at least some element of unity. So my question to Horace is, how much of an awareness of that goal animates African politics today at any level, and particularly in relation to the leadership? Is there a vanguard? Is there a core that is actually making that a central goal, at least having that objective of unifying as a necessary step towards that global, that at least more dominant place in the world that you have been so consistently making reference to? So that's my question. My question is really asked. I want you to give us a sense of how much of that objective, how much of that goal is a political objective among any group or some groups, or which group, if you can give us some idea of that.
Oh, thank you for that question. I want to give 3 examples of this goal in Africa. In 2007, there was a meeting of the African Union, and that meeting of the African Union agreed that they were going to have steps towards the African currency. And Gaddafi was the chairperson of the African Union. And the overthrow of Gaddafi in Libya is directly related to the goal of creating an African currency. In fact, the Sarkozy said that we must defend the euro, because any steps by Africa to have unity, even minimum unity at the level of cooperating outside of the European currency or outside of the CFA, which is the currency that holds Africa as hostage, is opposed by France and the Europeans. That's the first example I want to give you in Libya. And Africa cannot recover until we stabilize Libya and get rid of France and the United States and NATO out of Libya. The second example I want to give you is what is called the African payment system. And the African payment system is something that Barbados and the CARICOM wants to join with Africa to bring into being so that they bypass the US dollar. The most concrete example is with the East African community. The East African community comprises of 6 states: Kenya, Uganda, Tanzania, Rwanda, South Sudan, Burundi, and DRC, 7 states. The East African community is the most advanced in terms of integration. They have now signed a protocol for establishing the East African currency and the East African currency central bank. It is now going back to the parliaments of all the countries in the region to ratify. The United States, in order to undermine this, is pushing for Kenya to undermine this by signing a strategic trade and investment partnership. So in each region, we have ECOWAS in the West African region, we have SADC in the Southern African region, but the one that is most advanced in this direction is the East African community. East African community is very important because of its level of integration at present, and because the DRC has become a member of the East African community. And I think we have to focus our attention and interact with those brothers and sisters who want stability and peace in East Africa with an East African federated community.
Thank you very much, Horace. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Zofia.
Yes, thank you so much for this really great informational presentation. I had a question about the piece you were talking about with the racial element. One of the things that I have been trying to think through is how to relate what is going on with China and its relationship with Africa and other parts of the world, and racial capitalism, and how to think about the racial logics behind or undergirding some of or any of what is happening. So I was wondering if you can share your wisdom on how you're thinking about that issue.
Yes, thank you very much. To use a formulation, racial capitalism, is to state that capitalism has always been bound up with white supremacy. And that's from its origins in the transatlantic slave trade through its evolution in the United States with the coercion and the white supremacy, which bound back with Europe, with Western Europe, meaning that capitalism was always racist. Now, Japanese, when they started to become capitalists, the Europeans made the Japanese honorary whites. And the Japanese are integrated in the G7 as honorary whites. With the Chinese, there's a different problem because the Europeans are divided on whether the Chinese should be called honorary whites. And so one of the statements from the United States State Department is a statement from one of the officials of the State Department to say, for the first time, the United States has a competitor that is non-white. That is, the racism of United States capitalists against the Chinese is bound up with this war against China, which they have actually given a date. Now, the challenge for global Pan-Africanists is if the United States is against China because it's non-white, how could they call upon Africans who they're racist towards to align themselves with the United States against China? So the point I'm trying to make, if I didn't make it explicitly, is Africans have to be independent globally to educate the Chinese about racism and to oppose white racism in the United States, because white racism in the United States will require fascism to go to war against China. In short,
Sorry, I just wanted to kind of expand Sophia's question. Within China itself, in the Chinese economy, like, is there that racial hierarchy? Like you mentioned, the Great Han. Are they the elite capitalist? Is there, like, you know, can you see capitalism and the racial hierarchy within the Chinese economy itself and economic relations?
I don't think you can call it racial in China. You can have ethnic differences in China. For example, one big section of the Chinese capitalists, I don't know if you can call them Han. These are the Hakka people. These are the Chinese capitalists and traders who went all across East Asia. They're in Singapore, they're in Taiwan, they're in Vietnam, they're in Malaysia, all up to San Francisco. So this is one group of people I learned about by going towards southern China. When you meet Chinese and you ask them about the Hakka people, they're a special group of people. Now, the Chinese ethnic differences, and I showed you about different ethnic groups in China. There's more challenges there, especially in relationship to the language and culture and Han chauvinism. And I don't think it's based on race. It's based on historic differences between regions in China. And I think part of our struggles against racism is also to educate ourselves against racism, racial hierarchy, because even in Africa, like, we have this hierarchy. Some of our brothers and sisters cannot support the Sudanese revolution because they think the Sudanese are Arabs. And so in the global Pan-African movement, our position in terms of recognizing the humanity of all, but recognizing the special exploitation of Africans, our intellectual work should be developed to the point where we educate others about human freedom and emancipation.
Thank you for that clarification. Rodney, yes.
Yeah, thank you, Comrade Horace, for your very rich presentation. Yeah, you have opened my eyes to looking at China in a much more nuanced way. Thinking about the Chinese capitalists as well as the Chinese communists. Even here in the Caribbean, we have some issues the way that on some of the projects, not to the extent of in Africa, but we do hear complaints about exploitation of Chinese workers working on the projects, and even some of the Barbadian workers working on some of these projects. In fact, just over the weekend, there was this story. Now, I think the big question, however, is how to move or how to get the African misleaders move to this new plane of development where Africa will be this number one by 2035. And it raises questions as well, whether this number one will mean a very capitalist Africa, and what would be the implications of this number one for the African working peoples as well. And I'm kind of using your framework, looking at the war of after the Second World War that tossed up a lot of progressive thought and progressive organizations. And I'm looking at this conjunction with this war, and I'm straining my eyes and ears to see if we will get this kind of political, this progressive thought and this progressive action in order to kind of force and push and cajole our misleaders to really work in the interests of the masses of African people. So can you shed some light how we can lift this elephant in the room? Thank you.
Well, thank you. And I'm glad you came, because this education session is part of the task of the Global Pan-African Movement. The Global Pan-African Movement must take the lead in what are the questions to be on the table. And if we take the incongruous position that we're working towards the unification of Africa under the leadership of the working peoples, the road to get there is not going to be smooth. But in other words, some form of state capitalism with private enterprise, which we've seen in, say, South Africa, for example, which could become more progressive and become more embedded in the South African workers. Let me give you an example. The United States has passed an act against Africa called the Maligned Russia Act, which they're pressuring South Africa and other African countries to take sides in the Ukraine war. The extent to which they pressure South Africa, if that pressure pushes South Africa to strengthen itself with the working peoples of South Africa, the miners, the students, in the transition after the war, South Africa can play a progressive role. I'm saying that a country like Tanzania, even with its capitalist government, can play a progressive role, but we can do that through African organizations. Let's take one organization that I believe we should be pushing, even with the present state, Pan-African Gold Council. The Pan-African Gold Council would say that instead of taking gold out of the ground and having individual countries not refining the gold in Africa, that Africa have a council, just like OPEC, just like the bauxite organization that we had with the Caribbean and other countries, a gold council where African students, intellectuals, workers, and government standardize the mining of gold in Africa. One doesn't have to be a radical socialist country. Indonesia is doing this. Indonesia is saying that no unprocessed mineral should go from Indonesia. Indonesia is a capitalist country. So I'm saying that even before we go towards socialism or any more progressive government, it is in the interest of Africa not to have billions of dollars taken outside of Africa in minerals or in resources. But our intellectual work does not focus on building these institutions. For example, the amount of research we do on oil and gas in Africa. We don't have an African oil and gas consortium that consolidate. But the extent to which China is in Africa means that when Dangote is building a refinery in Nigeria, Dangote can call on Chinese, Turkish, Korean, United States, German capital. And I think this is the opening that this new situation has given for us. But it means that our intellectual work, our political work must be sharper and clearer of what we want for Africans. So African intellectual in Barbados, the African intellectual in Libya would be collaborating on the rights of women to have water, the rights of youths to have electricity, so that our work, we should take it more seriously in what we're fighting for. I don't know if that satisfies you, Rodney.
Yeah, I'm satisfied. I'm satisfied.
Okay, thank you.
Mahi, you had a question earlier, or are you good? Okay, you asked it. Can I ask as a chair a question? I have a lot of questions. Okay. So one
plus I'm hoping Silla will ask his question, because somebody must ask the question about whether Chinese are the imperialist country, because Walter mentioned it, and I want us to get back to it, because so many people believe China is an imperialist country. But go ahead, ask a question.
That's actually was one of the questions that I had, is like how people just say every country that is becoming a big economic power is imperialist. But I wanted to ask one question particular to your experience there, without talking much about biography. But in my experience here in the United States, when I encounter a lot of Chinese friends, classmates, and so forth, it is quite saddening to hear their thoughts about global geopolitics, meaning they don't know the history of Taiwan. They don't know why South Korea and North Korea are, South Korea is being colonized by the United States. They don't know the history of the region that well. And they are very, as in colloquial terms, drank the liberal Kool-Aid. They just see America as a model. So I'm just wondering, ideologically, how aligned are the people of the People's Republic of China with the state project, be it this new BRICS, be it in multipolarity, and the rise of China? That's kind of one largely question, because some of them, they perceive China, quote unquote, as being imperialist right now. So thoughts on the interpellation of the citizens in the country. How is that going?
Okay.
And can I just squeeze in something onto that question as well? Because one of the things that I also find that among also my Black students will talk about is the high levels of anti-Blackness in China. And so how do we overcome that aspect in terms of the work that we have to do as the global Pan-African movement?
Thank you so much. Let me deal with that front on. Anti-Blackness is there in China. It is there even in the language of how they refer to Black people. And the way to attack it is to be straightforward with the Chinese, to say that you have internalized in your attempt to modernize. And I would say this is also a class issue in China. It's a class issue because the Chinese workers, poor farmers, peasants, they are very humble people. And they don't have a drop of anti-Blackness in them. In fact, what they would have is curiosity. And some people get offended because they might want to touch your hair or something like that. I wouldn't call that anti-Blackness. But the middle classes, the upper classes, the ones who have stolen millions of dollars from the Chinese peasants workers who come to the United States, who want to be a superpower, they have internalized anti-Blackness. So I think the work we have to do is to put out our position, which is based on clear class. I can use some biography here in terms of my relationship with the Chinese. I have been a visiting professor in China in the #1 university in Tsinghua in the International Relations Department. The colleague that I interact with, I have been to his village and I have had hours and hours and days of discussion with him about the Chinese project. At his village, and his parents are poor peasants who have a little shop selling ginger. He went to school in China and he is in the department, he's the head of international relations. In the very same department that he's in, there are other professors whose grandparents were landowners. And those people look down on him inside of that department. because he's not from the right stock and the right background. So these class differences in China exist even among the educated strata. So our task is that we should be sensitive to these class differences and that we should be always drilling. The reason someone put me to the place where you have the hukou is because they knew I was sympathetic to Chinese workers and they wanted to explain to me that they're Chinese workers who are fighting against the Chinese state. So, and when I went among those Chinese workers, I've seen they've traveled to Africa, they're traveling to the World Social Forum, they've traveled to Venezuela, and they're very hungry for developing relations. So the question of fighting racism in China is not an easy task, but it's a task that we should put before the Chinese when we deal with them. We don't just go before them and just be crude about it, but in terms of our interaction or intellectual work, if they manifest any white supremacist ideas, we remind them what white supremacy has done to China and that Africans will not stand against white supremacy among Europeans and accept it by Chinese. Now let me come to the question that everybody is asking. Is China an imperialist country? And can we say that what China is doing in Africa is imperialist? I would argue that China is exploiting Africans, but China is not an imperialist country. And not every country that exploits another is an imperialist country. And not every country, let me give an example. Barbadians have investment in Guyana, or Trinidad have investments in Jamaica. The fact that Trinidad capitalists or Barbadian capitalists are more developed than Guyanese capitalists does not make them imperialists. Similarly, the fact that Turkey is a very developed country, Turkey would want to go back to hark on the memory of the Ottoman Empire, but Turkey does not have the wherewithal to project imperial power. Similarly, while France is weaker than China, one can say France is an imperialist country and say China is not imperialist for the following reasons. Imperialism is not only economic exploitation. Imperialism involves, one, finance capital dominating a country. Two, culture. There's no possibility that the Chinese language will become the language of Africa. Most educated people in Africa speak a European language, French, English, Portuguese. So the African autonomy has developed strong enough that Chinese capital, even if it becomes very strong, would not replace the European languages or African languages. Thirdly, religion. One of the most important aspects of imperialism is the culture of imperialism through religion. I don't think the Chinese, in pushing Confucianism or Buddhism, will be able to overcome the strength of the religions that are in Africa, African religions. Fourthly, at the cultural level, I don't think Chinese language or culture can dominate Africa. So yes, Chinese capitalists exploit Africa, but the sum total of cultural, economic, religious, linguistic basis of imperialism, the Chinese does not have this. It will take them another 50 years to develop that because European imperialism did not develop over 10 or 15 years. And the Chinese economic exploitation of Africa has really developed in the past 20 years.
Can I ask a quick follow-up question?
Please do. This is political education.
Yeah, this is, thank you for bringing the question of cultural hegemony. But back to kind of concentrating again on the economics. So some of the debates I've been having with some, I call them behind their back and also in front of their faces, tankies and also Trotskyites, that China, it's not in China's interest to have let's say, countries with nationalized natural resources, meaning that they would still rather to have weak African states that would need to export raw materials in order for them to be manufactured in China and then exported globally for China to usurp the surplus value, essentially. But understandably, what China does is that it does not intervene in internal politics. If there are unions in some country, they wouldn't try to de-unionize them. If there are no labor laws and labor is exploited, they would come in and continue to exploit that, as opposed to the Europeans when they try to do the structural adjustments and so forth. But isn't it not in China's interest that we have a strong, strong national governments or regional powers in Africa to actually offset this super exploitation, as Samir Amin calls it?
Yes.
Can I add a follow-up to that? And so in relation to kind of that also, when you talked about like our position and if the time comes that the US and China, or when the time comes that they'll go to war, in what ways do we expect China to leverage Africa, or what leverages will China use, right? What do you think?
Okay. Let us be clear. I am of the view that the Chinese capitalists and the Chinese themselves, nationalists, are opposed to African unity. Because the Chinese, the Russians, the Japanese, the Turks, the Europeans, and the Americans are opposed to African unity. Because African unity would make Africa very distinguished in the world. So I have no qualms about whether the Chinese are socialists or capitalists. They're not in favor of African unity. So it is for us in the global Pan-African movement and in the global Africa to be able to fight for unification. And even before we have unification, in a place like the Caribbean, the reason we have cricket, the university, is because of the struggles of the Caribbean workers since 1937. In the areas of East Africa, the struggles of the African workers, whether the African workers have state power or not, they should be able to have better conditions for health, safety, transportation, housing, education, and the environment. And to struggle for those things means you're struggling to strengthen the African working peoples. The Chinese know that whatever the state Africa is in, they will have to negotiate with Africa, because the Chinese economy as the #1 manufacturing power in the world cannot continue to exist without African cobalt, African nickel, African bauxite, African iron ore, and African gold. So it is up to the progressive Pan-Africanists and progressive Africans to work towards strengthening the position of the working peoples and strengthening the democratized character of the state in Africa, so that the way the Chinese interact with the South African government and South African capital is very different from the way it interacts with the government of the Democratic Republic of the Congo or the government of Ghana. So it depends on the power that is vested in the state by the working people.
Thank you. Other questions? So I think if there aren't any questions, given that we have taken a lot of everyone's time, especially Moalim was probably you need to have some rest.
Let's see if there's one of our younger cadres have any question. Some of them are still here.
Yes.
Any of our younger cadres? I know one very young one who is here. Silla, you have any question? Let me call on you. You're not there?
Silla or Kaylee?
Or Amy. Amy, you have any question, Amy? I know Amy have a question. All right.
Sorry, I was disconnected. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
No, I don't have a question. I think you answered pretty well. I just was like everybody else. I've seen the media and the war on China, especially when it comes to the DRC and what they're doing there. So I guess you answered my question in like differentiating what are the characteristics of an imperial power that China does not possess.
Okay. And the struggle between the United States and China is centered right now in the DRC. Because the Chinese signed a resource for infrastructure deal with the Congolese from 2007, 2008. They cannot put into being because the United States and through Rwanda has been destabilizing Eastern Congo, and they want to ensure that we have this artisanal mining in the Congo. The Congo is the example of having a state that has minimum control. If the Congo had even the kind of peace that we have in Tanzania or Kenya, because Kenya is not peaceful. Kenya has problems with the working peoples, of strikes, and even Al-Shabaab. But even with the level where Kenya is, but you can travel from one place in Kenya to the next. You cannot travel like that in the Democratic Republic of the Congo is a poster child of Western imperial plunder and destruction. That is why we are of the view that if the East African community strengthens and we have investments in infrastructure and there's collaboration between the East African community and the Congo, we are talking about a very different Africa, even in the next 5 years or so. That's why our intellectual work has to be focused on having clarity as people in the global Pan-African movement.
Wait, one more question, sorry. Do you think this like differentiation of what the West does in Africa and what the Chinese are doing in Africa is on the ground? Like the people on the ground understand that China is not an imperial power? Because just speaking to people, like for example, from the DRC, they tend to lean towards the Americans rather than the Chinese because they see as an imperial power. So I'm just wondering if this understanding exists on the ground, or how do we export it if it doesn't?
Well, let's put it this way. When the Chinese, let me say one thing about Africa that many people don't know. The Chinese respect Africans, especially the Chinese peasants and Chinese workers, and they're amazed at the amount of freedom Africans have. And one of the things that you'll notice is when the Chinese traders goes into African villages, they right away marry African women and they want to settle down in Africa. Because they can, recently they could only have one child in China, and in Africa they have 5 or 6 child. So you can see marriages between Chinese workers and African peasant women all across Africa. Now, there are some people who talk that Chinese are imperialists and Chinese have so many workers, but Chinese are very jealous because when they go to Africa, they realize that Africans can have trade unions. Africans can move from Dar es Salaam to Tanga. They don't have to have hukou like they have in China. So the Chinese are learning from Africa because Africans have fought a certain amount of freedoms that the Chinese do not have through the control of the Communist Party over the past 70 years.
I just want to add, if you are following what the United States is doing, it's launching an information warfare, like information warfare on China, especially in Africa. Recently, the White House published a fact sheet that is going to be giving the US aid $8.9 billion to promote democracy and the human rights and independent investigative journalists in Africa. This particular one, highlighted because what they're saying in that particular project, they're going to be training young African journalists to expose what's commonly called malign Russian activities, and particularly malign Chinese activities in Africa. And so they're very, centered on attacking particularly China to create much disinformation. And one of the things that we saw a year ago was that China right now controls Uganda's airport, which was, a lie. And so they're pushing for that narrative. So they would de-link for any linking that might happen between South-South, meaning China and Africa. And they're trying to align Africa continuously with IMF, World Bank, as if it's the only alternative. So there is this, it is, information warfare that's happening. And a lot of Africans are consuming it, be it because of colonialism, because of cultural, political, and historic hegemony that we have had with the West. So.
And the global Pan-African movement should be a force against that information warfare.
Absolutely.